to turn your trauma into triumph? Well, first you have to address your trauma. You have to acknowledge it. You have to embrace it. You know, a lot of times we hear things like, oh, don't trigger me. Don't trigger me because I don't want to deal with my trauma. But the reality is that having a trigger, having something that triggers your trauma, it's actually a really healthy thing, because that means that you recognize it, that you're ready to address it, and you can start the process of healing. So what does it mean to turn our trauma into triumph? It means dealing with our trauma. We're not going to forget about it. It's not going to go away. We may still have triggers, but how do we respond to those triggers? And I would say the first thing we need to do, because your trauma wasn't your fault, but sometimes we need to forgive ourselves. Sometimes with that trauma, there's shame and there's blame and all of those things. And so that healing begins with maybe forgiving the person who traumatized us, but also just really allowing that healing to envelop us, to forgive yourself. Now, when you can do that, and just let me say that's not overnight, that doesn't happen in one shot, and that's a long journey. That you may be triggered and go back to those feelings. That's okay. But the piece to remember is that when we are turning that into triumph to ultimately help others, that's why we want to do this. We want to help others heal, maybe. We want to help others lead, whether that's in our business, whether that's in an organization. We want to help our families, whatever that looks like for you. We need to use that trauma and channel it to really become incredible leaders. Now, one of the ways to do that is to stay humble. Stay humble. It is okay to admit you're wrong. It's okay to admit you're triggered. I was actually giving a presentation at an event, and all of a sudden, just out of the blue, it was just the weirdest thing. Something triggered me. I don't even know what it was, but it just took me right back to my childhood. And I had to stop, and I had to take a second. And fortunately, someone was with me, so I could step out of the room and just breathe and just remind myself, that's not who you are anymore. You're not that little girl who was victimized. You are a strong, independent woman. That self-talk is really important. And I was able to come back into the room and complete my job and do what I needed to do. But understanding that trauma brings resilience. Resilience is one step forward, two steps back. And when we lead through that, when we can say, you know what, I'm not perfect. I'm not somebody who has all of the answers. In fact, I don't know everything. I may not be able to answer this question, but I know that we can work through this together. That's the type of leader that somebody who turns trauma into triumph can become. It's not easy. It's challenging. But I promise that when you can channel your trauma into ways to activate your leadership, into ways to teach people through, that's when people will look at you and say, that's a leader that I want to follow. Someone who has humility, someone who has a heart to lead, and someone who recognizes, I'm not perfect, nor do I have to be, but I can relate to you. I can have compassion for you. I can understand what you're saying because I have been there in some way, shape, or form. That's turning your trauma into triumph, and that's true leadership.